The morning after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood was buzzing like never before. Groups of neighbors stood in their yards whispering about what had happened. And for once, the whispers weren't fearful glances in Karen's direction, but rather sighs of relief that someone had finally stood up to her. Emily was still in the hospital under observation, but she called me to tell me she felt safer knowing Karen wasn't roaming around making trouble. Yet I couldn't shake the unease that lingered, because Karen was cunning, manipulative, and spiteful. And jail wouldn't silence her for long, sure enough. Later that day, I received a call from the sheriff's office informing me that Karen had posted bail. She was free until her court date. The thought of her stomping back into the neighborhood made my stomach churn, and I knew she wouldn't return quietly. She'd come back louder, meaner, and more dangerous than ever. So I doubled down on gathering evidence, making copies of the video, witness statements, and hospital records. So that even if she tried to twist the truth, the facts would stay intact. When Karen returned the following afternoon, it was like a storm rolling back into town. She strutted into her house with her nose in the air as if nothing had happened. But the bruised pride was visible in her stiff movements and the way her eyes darted around at the neighbors watching. A few people shouted things at her. "Shame on you. You saw what you did." But she only smirked, clutching her clipboard like a shield. Later that evening, just as I expected, she knocked on my door. I opened it only because I wanted to see how far she'd go. Her face was painted with that smug, holier-than-thou look she always wore. "You've made a very big mistake," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You think the sheriff's department scares me? Please, I practically run this community, and when this is all over, you and your wife will be packing your bags." I let her words hang in the air before calmly saying, "Karen, you nearly killed my wife and child. Saw it? You can threaten all you want, but this time, you won't win." Azurk faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. Snapping back, "We'll see about that," and stomped off my porch. I closed the door and immediately called the detective to let him know she was already trying to intimidate us. He assured me it would be noted as part of her ongoing harassment. Meanwhile, the HOA board, desperate to cling to their power, called for a special emergency meeting. I was sent an official notice demanding my attendance, which almost made me laugh. They wanted to corner me, to try and spin the narrative in Karen's favor, but I wasn't walking into their den unprepared. I showed up with copies of the video and with 2 neighbors who had volunteered to stand with me. The meeting was tense from the start. Karen sat at the head of the table despite technically being suspended from her position as president. Her allies flanked her, and a few neutral board members looked nervous. She opened the meeting by declaring that the community had been plagued by false accusations, and that I had maliciously misrepresented her actions. I waited until she finished her monologue before calmly sliding the USB drive across. "The table, play it," I said. The board hesitated but eventually plugged it in. And as Karen's voice filled the room screaming at the EMTs to stop the ambulance, her allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One even looked away. Karen tried to cut in, claiming it was taken out of context, but the video was too clear. Her words undeniable. When it ended, the room fell silent. Finally, one board member cleared his throat and said, "Karen, this isn't defensible." Her face flushed red, her jaw clenched, and she snapped, "You're all cowards," before storming out of the meeting, slamming the door so hard the wall shook. After that, things began to shift. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak out now began circulating petitions to remove her permanently from the board. Several even came forward with their own stories of Karen's harassment, how she had fined them unfairly, threatened to sue over trivial matters, or trespassed on their property to inspect violations. What shocked me most was the sheer number of people she had bullied. And it became clear that we weren't just fighting for justice for Emily and me. We were fighting to free the entire neighborhood from her reign of terror. But Karen wasn't done. She retaliated in the only way she knew how, by escalating. She began filing bogus complaints with the city against us, claiming our lawn was unsightly, that our trash cans were left out too long, even that our dog barked excessively. Every claim was investigated and dismissed, but the stress piled on. I could see it wearing on Emily, who was trying to focus on her recovery, so I decided it was time to push back harder. I contacted a lawyer, not just to handle the criminal case, but to prepare a civil lawsuit against Karen and the HOA for harassment and emotional distress. The lawyer agreed. We had a strong case and advised me to keep documenting every action she took. One evening, about a week later, I caught Karen standing in our yard with her phone out, taking pictures of our house without permission. I walked outside and asked what she thought she was doing. She smirked and said, "Just gathering evidence. You'll be gone soon enough." I pulled out my own phone and started recording, telling her she was trespassing. When she realized I was filming, she tried to snatch my phone, but I backed away and kept it trained on her. Within minutes, the sheriff's deputy arrived after I called, and for once, she was the one told to leave under threat of arrest, watching. Her stomp down the street fuming felt like a small victory, but I knew she was plotting her next move even then. People like Karen didn't stop until they were forced to. That same week, the sheriff himself called me. He said he wanted to personally reassure Emily and me that the department was taking the case seriously. He even came by the hospital to visit Emily. His presence was a comfort, and he told us folks, like her, think they're above the law. But I promise you she won't be this time. Hearing that from the sheriff himself gave Emily a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. She smiled for the first time since the incident, and I held her hand, knowing we were finally turning a corner.
Oh.
But deep down, I also knew Karen was still scheming, and the real battle was only just beginning. Because when her court date came, she would pull every trick in the book to escape accountability, and I had to be ready to face her head-on. I raced to the hospital behind the ambulance, my heart pounding with every mile, praying that Emily and the baby would make it through the ordeal that Karen had caused. When I arrived, the paramedics were already rushing her inside, and a nurse stopped me at the desk, asking for her name and information. My hands shook as I signed the forms. I barely got through the questions before they ushered me into the waiting area and told me the doctors were working on stabilizing her. Those minutes felt like hours, every second ticking by like a weight pressing on my chest. Finally, a doctor came out, his face serious but calm. He explained that Emily had suffered severe stress and bleeding, but thankfully, they had been able to stabilize both her and the baby. For now, they were safe. But he made it clear that the delay in treatment could have caused irreversible harm if it had gone on longer. I nodded numbly, relief flooding me. But right behind it came a surge of anger so powerful that my fists clenched at my sides. Karen's stunt could have cost us everything. And I wasn't about to let it slide. I called the sheriff's office immediately and asked to speak with the deputy who had been at the scene. When he got on the phone, he told me Karen had been detained briefly, but released pending further investigation. I couldn't believe she was already home while my wife lay in a hospital bed fighting for our child's life. The deputy assured me that the district attorney's office was reviewing the case for possible charges. But I knew Karen, she wouldn't sit back quietly. She'd already be spinning the story, painting herself as the victim. So I told the deputy I wanted to press every possible charge against her: obstruction of emergency services, reckless endangerment, harassment, whatever could stick, and he promised he'd pass it along to the DA. That night, sitting by Emily's bedside, I told her everything. She was pale and exhausted, but her eyes burned with the same fury I felt. She put our baby's life in danger. Emily whispered, her voice cracking. She has to pay for this. I promised her she would. That we would fight back, not just for ourselves, but so Karen could never do this to anyone else. The next morning, as Emily slept, I went home to gather the evidence. I printed the video I had taken on my phone of Karen screaming at the EMTs and blocking the ambulance. Her words crystal clear, her smug tone undeniable. I gathered the statements from neighbors who had witnessed the scene, several of whom texted me afterward expressing outrage and offering to testify. By the time I was done, I had a file so thick it looked like a legal brief, and I marched it straight down to the sheriff's office. When the detective assigned to the case saw the video, his eyebrows shot up. "This is worse than we thought," he said. "She didn't just interfere, she knowingly jeopardized 2 lives. That's not going to look good in court." Hearing that gave me a sliver of satisfaction, but it wasn't enough. I wanted to see her face when she realized she wasn't untouchable anymore. Word of what happened spread quickly through the neighborhood, and by the time I got back home, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Whispering, some glaring at Karen's house across the street, I could hear her shouting through an open window, ranting on the phone about how she was being persecuted for enforcing the rules. A few neighbors approached me quietly, offering their support. One elderly woman even hugged me and said, "We're with you, son. She's gone too far this time." Their words gave me strength, but they also fueled my determination, because it wasn't just us she had hurt. It was an entire community living in fear of her tyranny, and now we had the chance to end it. 2 days later, deputies returned to Karen's house with a warrant. I watched from my porch as they knocked on her door, her smug face appearing for only a moment before twisting into shock as they informed her she was being arrested. She tried to argue, waving her HOA clipboard and screeching that they had no authority. But the deputies didn't flinch. They cuffed her right there in the driveway as half the neighborhood came out to watch. Phones recording, whispers buzzing, Karen screamed about lawsuits, about how we'd all regret this, but for the first time. Her words fell flat. No one rushed to her defense. No one cared. She was led into the back of the cruiser, red-faced and defeated, and in that moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. But as anyone who's dealt with people like Karen knows, it's never really over that easily, while she sat in jail awaiting arraignment. Her allies on the HOA board started circling the wagons, sending out newsletters claiming she had been unfairly targeted and that my wife and I were troublemakers trying to undermine community order. I nearly laughed when I read it because I knew the truth was stronger than any propaganda. And now the sheriff's office had the proof. Still, it showed me that we weren't just fighting Karen. We were fighting an entire system she had poisoned with her power. And it was going to take more than just one arrest to clean it out. But with Emily recovering and the baby safe, I had the fire in me to see it through. And as I stood on my porch that evening, watching the sun set over the cul-de-sac, I swore to myself that I wouldn't stop until Karen and everyone who enabled her learned what real accountability looked like. The morning of closing arguments dawned heavy with anticipation. Emily and I arrived at the courthouse early, escorted by deputies for extra security since the judge had warned of possible outbursts from Karen's supporters. The benches were once again packed with neighbors, reporters, and even curious residents from nearby communities who had heard about the case. The air buzzed with quiet murmurs, everyone eager to see how it would play out. When Karen entered, she looked far less composed than before, her blazer wrinkled, her hair disheveled, and the confident stride she once had was replaced with a stiff shuffle. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, but when she saw me and Emily holding hands, her face twisted with that same familiar contempt, as if she still believed she held some kind of power over us. The judge entered, called the court to order, and the prosecutor began his closing remarks. His voice firm but calm as he reminded the jury of the evidence. The video of Karen screaming at the EMTs, the testimonies from neighbors, the Ring doorbell recording where Karen threatened to teach us a lesson, and Emily's own heart-wrenching statement about how helpless she felt that night. "This case isn't about HOA bylaws," he said. His tone sharpened. "It's about basic human decency. It's about a woman who thought her authority outweighed a mother's right to medical care, and that cannot be tolerated in any community." Karen's lawyer tried to salvage what little he could, arguing that she had been overzealous but never meant harm. He claimed she was a passionate leader who sometimes crossed boundaries, but the words rang hollow compared to the mountain of evidence. When the jury was finally dismissed to deliberate, the tension in the room was palpable. Karen sat rigidly, muttering under her breath, her hands clenched into fists. Hours passed as we all waited, the courthouse buzzing with speculation. Some reporters whispered predictions, neighbors exchanged nervous looks, and I held Emily's hand, trying to mask my own anxiety. Finally, after nearly 5 hours, the jury returned. The judge called the court to order, and everyone stood as the foreperson delivered the verdict. On the charge of obstruction of emergency medical services, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, guilty. On the charge of harassment, guilty. and on the charge of violating ADA law, guilty. Gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom. Some neighbors even clapped before the judge sternly called for silence. Karen's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She shook her head violently, whispering no, 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 as if denying reality could change the outcome. The judge announced that sentencing would be scheduled in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, Karen was to be remanded into custody. The bailiffs moved toward her, and that's when she completely lost control. She leapt to her feet, screaming, "This is a witch hunt? You're all against me? I built this community. You can't do this to me." The bailiffs grabbed her arms as she thrashed, her voice cracking with desperation. "I'll sue all of you. You'll regret this." But her words were drowned out by the gavel pounding and the bailiffs dragging her from the courtroom. The sight of her being hauled away in handcuffs while still screeching was something I'll never forget. It was the unraveling of a woman who had believed herself untouchable only to finally face accountability. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Neighbors cheered, reporters rushed forward, and one even asked me, "How does it feel to finally see justice?" I paused, holding Emily's hand, and simply said, "It feels like safety." Because that was what it truly meant, not just for us, but for the entire neighborhood. No more walking on eggshells. No more fear of retaliation over something as trivial as a lawn decoration. People hugged us, thanked us, and some even cried, one man said. "You didn't just stand up for your wife, you stood up for all of us." And for the first time since moving into that neighborhood, I felt like we belonged. But the fight wasn't completely over. Karen's sentencing was still ahead. And my lawyer reminded me that her allies within the HOA might try to regroup, though their power had been shattered. Sure enough, within a week, the board tried to hold a vote of confidence to reinstate Karen in absentia, claiming her arrest was unfair, but that move backfired spectacularly. Dozens of residents flooded the meeting, shouting them down and demanding immediate elections. Under pressure, the board finally relented, and within days, Karen's cronies were voted out and replaced with level-headed neighbors who wanted nothing more than to restore peace. Ruth, the elderly woman who had been bullied over her garden gnome, was elected president. Her first act was to apologize publicly to the community for years of mistreatment under Karen's leadership. Her second act was to announce the HOA would fully cooperate with law enforcement in Karen's sentencing and with any civil lawsuits filed against her. Meanwhile, Emily was recovering better than ever. With each day she grew stronger. Her smile returning, her laughter filling our home again, she told me. I can finally breathe without worrying about that woman showing up at our door. And it was true. Life felt lighter, more hopeful. Even the neighborhood itself seemed transformed. Kids played outside without parents, nervously glancing over their shoulders. People waved and chatted freely. The shadow Karen had cast was lifting. It felt like we were all reclaiming not just our homes, but our sense of community. Still, I knew Karen wouldn't go quietly into that good night. She had 2 weeks before sentencing, and if I had learned anything, it was that she thrived on chaos. So I braced myself for the possibility of one final storm before her downfall was sealed. Sure enough, just days before her sentencing, rumors began swirling that Karen was trying to strike a deal. Her lawyer filed motions arguing for leniency, claiming her community service record and dedication to leadership should spare her jail time, but the prosecutor pushed back hard, presenting a full dossier of her years of abusive behavior as HOA president. The judge wasn't impressed by Karen's pleas, but it meant the final sentencing hearing would be crucial. Neighbors once again organized to show up en masse, determined to ensure the court understood just how much damage she had caused. The night before the hearing, Emily and I sat quietly in our living room, holding hands in the soft glow of the lamp. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "we'll know if this is finally over," and I nodded, my heart heavy but hopeful. "One way or another," I replied, "justice will have the last word." The moment that ambulance door was slammed in my pregnant wife's face during the worst scare of our lives, I knew we were about to fight a battle far bigger than any family should ever have to endure. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, or seen how far a Karen can go when they think they're in charge, you need to hear this story because it will shock you, make you furious. and remind you why standing up for what's right matters. So before we get into it, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories, because you won't want to miss how this insane ordeal unfolded and how the sheriff finally made them regret everything. My wife, Emily, was 7 months pregnant with our first child, and it had been a rough pregnancy from the start. She'd been on bed rest for weeks because of complications, and every day I lived with the constant worry that something might go wrong. So when I woke up that morning to her screaming in pain, clutching her stomach, I thought my heart might stop right there. I dialed 911 with shaking hands and begged them to hurry, telling them she was pregnant and bleeding, possibly miscarrying, and within minutes, the ambulance sirens were wailing as paramedics rushed into our home, carefully lifting Emily onto the stretcher as I held her hand and told her everything was going to be okay. But we had no idea that the real nightmare was waiting outside. The ambulance pulled up in front of our house, lights flashing, and as they wheeled her toward the back doors, suddenly a voice shrieked across the street, our HOA president, Karen, marching over with her clipboard like she owned the entire world, her blonde bob bouncing as she stomped toward us with fury in her eyes. She started yelling at the EMTs, "You can't park that vehicle here. This is HOA property. You're blocking the road and violating community safety rules." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife was crying out in pain, begging for help. And this woman was screaming about parking rules. The EMTs tried to reason with her, telling her it was a medical emergency. But Karen wasn't having it. She insisted the ambulance had to move to the visitor's lot like everyone else. Even though every second mattered for Emily and the baby then, in a moment that will forever haunt me, Karen physically stepped in front of the ambulance doors and blocked them from closing, demanding they remove Emily from the vehicle until the driver complied. One of the paramedics swore under his breath, another pleaded with her to step aside, but Karen doubled down, yelling about HOA bylaws, threatening to fine them and even threatening to call the police on the EMTs for trespassing. It was insanity, and before I could even process it, the paramedics forced into a corner, actually lowered my wife back onto the stretcher and rolled her out of the ambulance, placing her on the pavement as she sobbed and clutched her stomach. I will never forget the look in her eyes, terror, pain, and betrayal all at once, as the people meant to save her were prevented from doing their jobs by a power-hungry neighbor. I snapped, screaming at Karen, shoving my phone in her face as I recorded her tirade, telling her she was endangering 2 lives and she'd regret this, but she just sneered and said, "Rules are rules, and no one is above them, not even your wife." I thought I might hit her, but all my focus was on Emily, whose cries were getting weaker, her lips pale. So I called 911 again, this time demanding a sheriff come immediately, telling them my wife's life was at risk and that the HOA president was obstructing emergency medical services when the dispatcher heard the words pregnant, ambulance blocked, and life-threatening. She promised deputies were on their way. The EMTs tried to keep Emily stable while we waited, but every minute felt like an eternity. Finally, the sound of sirens filled the air again, and 2 sheriff's cruisers screeched into the cul-de-sac, deputies jumping out with urgency. One look at Emily writhing on the ground and they rushed to her aid. Barking orders at Karen to move out of the way, Karen puffed herself up like she was the queen of the block, waving her HOA badge and screaming that she had authority. But the deputies weren't having it. One of them told her in no uncertain terms that obstructing emergency personnel was a crime. And when she refused to back down, the deputy grabbed her clipboard, tossed it aside, and physically pulled her out of the way. Karen shrieked, threatening lawsuits. But no one cared anymore. The deputies helped the EMTs get Emily back into the ambulance, and within seconds they were gone, racing toward the hospital with sirens blaring, leaving me standing there trembling with rage and disbelief. One deputy stayed behind to take my statement while Karen continued her tirade. But this time, she wasn't in control anymore. The deputy warned her that she was facing serious charges for obstruction and reckless endangerment, but Karen just scoffed, insisting she was upholding the community's rules and that if people start making exceptions, everything falls apart. I couldn't believe her lack of humanity. It was like the life of my wife, an unborn child, meant absolutely nothing. compared to her obsession with HOA regulations, but even as I sat in the back of the cruiser giving my statement, I promised myself one thing and wasn't going to get away with this. Not this time, because she had crossed a line no one could come back from. The day of Karen's preliminary hearing arrived, with tension thicker than the summer humidity in our small town. I woke up early, unable to sleep from the anxiety gnawing at me. Emily, still recovering but determined to stand beside me, insisted on coming too. Despite my protests that she needed rest, she said, "If Karen can try to scare us by almost taking our baby, then I need to show her I won't back down." And that was enough for me to know we were walking into court as a united front. The courthouse was buzzing with reporters because word had spread quickly about the outrageous incident. ADA violations mixed with HOA corruption was juicy news. Seeing cameras outside the doors only added to the surreal feeling. When Karen arrived, she wore a pristine cream-colored blazer with her hair styled neatly. Her face plastered with fake composure, as if she were the victim of some smear campaign. But the smugness in her eyes betrayed her. She strutted past the cameras as though she were there to give a speech, not stand trial for nearly killing a pregnant woman. And when she caught sight of us, she smiled tightly and mouthed, "You'll regret this," before disappearing into the courtroom. Inside, the judge wasted no time cutting through the theatrics. The prosecution laid out the charges clearly: obstruction of emergency medical services, harassment, reckless endangerment, and violations of ADA law. They played the video of Karen screaming at the EMTs, trying to physically stop them from loading Emily into the ambulance. The jury members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering to each other in disbelief. Karen's lawyer attempted to paint her as concerned for community safety, claiming she thought the ambulance was misusing private HOA property. But that argument fell apart when the prosecutor presented the petition signed by dozens of neighbors condemning Karen's actions, and witness testimonies describing her bullying behavior over the years. Emily herself was called to the stand, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. She recounted how terrified she was that night, how Karen's shouting and interference made her feel like her life and the life of her unborn child didn't matter. And by the end of her testimony, even the judge's stern expression softened with sympathy. Karen avoided looking at Emily, instead scribbling notes furiously, her cheeks flushed with rage. Outside the courtroom, during a recess, neighbors who had attended the hearing came up to us offering hugs, handshakes, and words of support. People we hadn't even known well before were suddenly allies. One elderly woman named Ruth said, "She's been terrorizing us for years, but you two finally gave us the courage to say enough is enough." Hearing that made me realize this was no longer just about us. This was about an entire neighborhood reclaiming their peace from one woman's tyranny. When the session resumed, Karen's defense attempted to introduce character witnesses, but even those backfired. One supposed supporter admitted under cross-examination that Karen had fined her for having a single garden gnome in her yard, which drew muffled laughter from the courtroom. Karen's face darkened, her composure cracking more with each passing hour. By the time closing arguments rolled around, her lawyer looked more exhausted than confident, and the judge announced that a full trial would move forward given the strength of evidence against her. Karen's bail conditions were tightened, including a restraining order preventing her from coming within 200 feet of our home. Seeing her storm out of the courtroom, flanked by her dwindling allies, was satisfying, but I knew she wasn't finished. The following weeks were quieter, and for the first time since moving in, Emily and I could enjoy simple evenings without fear of Karen barging into our yard with her clipboard. Neighbors began hosting barbecues, block parties, and little gatherings, almost as if reclaiming the neighborhood from the suffocating grip she had held for so long. But the tranquility was laced with anticipation, because her trial date loomed, and everyone knew Karen was the type to pull one last desperate stunt. Sure enough, late one night I noticed a car parked just beyond our driveway with its headlights off. When I stepped outside, the car drove off quickly. The sheriff later confirmed it was registered to Karen's cousin, who claimed he was just checking on the house. It was a reminder that Karen still had people willing to do her dirty work. So I installed extra cameras around the house, and my lawyer filed an emergency motion to ensure her bail conditions were enforced strictly. The judge agreed and issued a warning that any violation could land her back in jail immediately. As the trial approached, the pressure mounted. Reporters knocked on our door asking for statements, but I refused, telling them the courtroom was where the truth would be told. Emily, though still recovering, grew stronger every day, and her resilience inspired me to keep pushing the night before the trial. We sat on the porch holding hands, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple. She said quietly, "No matter what happens, I just want us to be okay." I squeezed her hand and promised, "We will be, because this ends tomorrow." And I meant it with every fiber of my being. We weren't just defending ourselves anymore. We were fighting for justice that would echo far beyond our little street, for every neighbor Karen had bullied, for every sleepless night we'd endured, for the child we almost lost. The trial would be the reckoning. The morning of the trial, the courthouse was packed, more reporters than before, more neighbors filling the benches. The prosecutor delivered a powerful opening statement framing Karen's actions as not just reckless but dangerous to public safety. Karen's lawyer tried to counter by painting her as a misunderstood leader, but the jury wasn't buying it. Witness after witness testified to her pattern of harassment. And when the EMT who had been on duty that night took the stand, his testimony was damning. He described how Karen physically tried to block the stretcher, how precious seconds were lost because of her interference, and how he had never in his career experienced anything so outrageous. Karen sat rigidly in her chair, her lips pressed so tightly together they turned white. Her lawyer whispered frantically to her, but she refused to look at him. Then came the moment that broke her facade completely, when the prosecutor revealed new evidence. Audio recordings from a neighbor's Ring doorbell that captured Karen bragging days before the incident that she would teach them a lesson if they think they can ignore HOA rules. The courtroom gasped, and Karen's composure finally cracked. She shouted, "That's taken out of context," before the judge slammed his gavel and warned her to remain silent. By the end of the day, it was clear the walls were closing in on Karen. The jury whispered among themselves, the prosecution's case airtight, and the judge announced that closing arguments would be delivered the following morning. Emily and I walked out of the courthouse exhausted but hopeful. Neighbors clapped us on the back, saying, "Tomorrow it's over," though I knew with Karen nothing was ever simple. She thrived on chaos, on bending rules, on slipping through cracks. But for the first time in a long time, I felt we had the upper hand. Because this wasn't just a fight against an HOA tyrant anymore. This was a fight for justice itself, and tomorrow the verdict would decide everything. The courthouse was even more crowded on the morning of Karen's sentencing. The air thick with anticipation, the tension palpable. Neighbors filled the benches. Reporters had cameras trained on the doors, and law enforcement stood guard and higher numbers than before. Karen was escorted in wearing an orange jumpsuit this time, instead of her prim blazers. Her hair pulled back harshly, and the smug arrogance that once defined her was replaced with an unsettling mix of defiance and desperation. She looked around the room as though searching for allies, but most of her so-called supporters had abandoned her by now. Their loyalty not strong enough to withstand the tidal wave of public outrage. She spotted us sitting near the front with Emily's hand resting protectively on her belly, and she sneered, mouthing something that looked like "You ruined me." Before being led to her seat, the sheriff himself walked in moments later, taking a place in the audience, his presence commanding a silent promise that justice would be seen through to the end. His eyes fixed firmly on Karen, and for once, she looked away. The judge entered, called the room to order, and began by reviewing the charges for the record. The list sounded even heavier spoken aloud: obstruction of emergency medical services, reckless endangerment, harassment, and violations of federal aid law. The prosecutor spoke first, delivering a scathing yet measured argument for why Karen deserved prison time, not probation. He cited not only the incident with Emily and the ambulance, but also her long history of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power in the neighborhood. This defendant wielded her position as a weapon, terrorizing residents for years. But when her lust for control escalated to interfering with medical professionals and endangering lives, she crossed a line that cannot be forgiven with a slap on the wrist. This community deserves protection, and justice demands accountability. His words carried through the silent courtroom like the crack of a whip. Every head turned toward Karen, who sat stiffly, her lips trembling but refusing to part. Then it was the defense's turn. Karen's lawyer looked worn out, his arguments threadbare. He spoke about her dedication to community service, her years as HOA president, her intentions being misinterpreted, and pleaded for leniency. "My client is not a danger to society," he said. "She is a woman who made a mistake in the heat of the moment," but his words were hollow. And even he seemed unconvinced. Karen herself then asked to speak. She rose shakily, gripping the podium, and tried to paint herself as the victim, her voice shrill as she said, "I was only trying to protect the neighborhood. I've given years of my life to this community, and this is how I'm repaid. They twist everything I've done to make me look like a monster, but I am not evil. I was trying to uphold the rules. If we allow people to ignore rules, what kind of chaos will we live in?" Her eyes darted toward us, blazing with fury. "They used me as a scapegoat. They destroyed me." But her tirade only further alienated the room. Neighbors shook their heads, some rolled their eyes, others whispered angrily. The judge banged his gavel and told her to sit down, clearly unimpressed by her refusal to show remorse. When it was Emily's turn to give a victim impact statement, the room grew still. She rose slowly, her voice soft but steady that night. When Karen stood in front of the ambulance and screamed at the EMTs, "I thought I was going to lose my baby. I thought I was going to die. I was scared. I was helpless." And she didn't see me as a human being in need of care. She saw me as an inconvenience to her rules. I will never forget the fear she put in me. And no one should ever have to feel that powerless in their own neighborhood. My child's life mattered. My life mattered. And Karen treated both as if they didn't. By the time Emily finished, tears filled many eyes in the courtroom, including mine. Her courage left Karen's excuses in ashes. Finally, the judge leaned forward, his expression stern, his voice deliberate. "I have reviewed the evidence, the testimonies, and the character of this case. This court cannot ignore the danger posed by the defendant's actions. This was not a simple lapse of judgment. This was a deliberate abuse of authority that endangered lives. For obstruction of emergency medical services, I sentence you to 5 years in state prison. For reckless endangerment, 2 years to run concurrently. For harassment, 1 year to run concurrently. And for ADA violations, a $50,000 fine and mandated restitution to the victims. Furthermore, you are permanently barred from serving in any HOA or similar governing body." Effective immediately, the gavel struck. Sealing Karen's fate, gasps rippled through the room. And for the first time, Karen's defiance shattered. She let out a guttural scream, collapsing into the bailiff's arms as they restrained her. Her face twisted with rage and despair. "You can't do this to me. I am the HOA. You'll all regret this." Her words echoed as she was dragged from the room. Her reign finally, irrevocably ended. Neighbors erupted into applause, cheers, even sobs of relief. Ruth hugged Emily tightly, whispering, "It's over, dear. It's finally over." The sheriff approached us afterward, tipping his hat. His voice low but resolute, she thought. She was untouchable, but the law touched her today, and she never hurt this community again. His presence was a reassurance that the battle we had fought wasn't in vain. And Emily squeezed my hand so tightly, I could feel the strength of her relief coursing through her. As we stepped outside, the cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but I simply told them justice was served and walked away, ready to close that chapter of our lives. In the days that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Like a fog lifting after years of suffocating control, people decorated their lawns freely, kids played without fear of Karen's complaints, and neighbors began working together to heal the damage she had caused. New HOA leadership focused on collaboration and compassion rather than punishment. The sheriff even stopped by once to share a laugh with us, saying, "I've never seen a community bounce back so fast once the poison was gone." Emily began to glow again, her pregnancy progressing safely under the care she deserved. And we finally felt at home in the neighborhood that had once felt like a battleground. Karen's name became a cautionary tale, spoken only in hushed, Tones or jokes about what not to do as a neighbor. Her house sat empty, her presence erased, her power dismantled. But deep down, I knew the scars she left behind would linger. The trauma of that night would never fully vanish. Emily sometimes woke from nightmares, clutching her belly, and I would hold her until the tremors faded, whispering that she was safe, that Karen was gone, and that no one would ever come between us and our right to live peacefully again. The sheriff had been right. Karen thought she was above the law. But the law had made her regret every twisted choice, and in the end, the community she once dominated was stronger without her than it had ever been under her thumb. Life after Karen's sentencing felt like waking up from a nightmare that had gone on far too long. The neighborhood was different, almost unrecognizable. With a weight lifted from its shoulders, lawns that were once sterile and silent began to bloom with flowers and decorations that had been forbidden for years. Children who used to glance nervously around before riding their bikes now laughed freely. Chalk drawings covered sidewalks, and holiday lights twinkled proudly from porches no longer under Karen's oppressive gaze. It was as if the entire community had been holding its breath. And now finally it exhaled. Emily and I would walk hand in hand through the streets, greeted with smiles and waves instead of the hushed tension that used to linger. But even in the newfound peace, there were moments when the memory of that night, the flashing ambulance lights, Karen's shrill voice, Emily's tears would creep back into our minds, scars invisible to others, but etched deeply into us both. As Emily's pregnancy progressed, the joy of preparing for our baby replaced the shadows Karen had cast. We painted the nursery a soft pastel yellow, decorated with tiny stars and moon decals. Each brushstroke a symbol of healing and hope. Neighbors, who had once kept to themselves, began stopping by with gifts, advice, or just warm smiles. Ruth, our dear neighbor who had stood by us through it all, brought over knitted blankets and told stories of raising her children. The sheriff even came one evening with a small, carved rocking horse his grandfather had made, placing it gently in the nursery corner, saying, "Every child deserves to grow up in a home free of fear." His words brought tears to Emily's. And I knew in that moment how grateful we were, not just for justice, but for the community that rallied around us after the storm. The HOA was completely restructured. New leadership was elected. This time the members were ordinary residents with no thirst for control or obsession with power. Their meetings were transparent and welcoming, decisions made by consensus. Rather than by decree, it was a transformation so stark it was almost hard to believe. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak against Karen now took part enthusiastically, suggesting improvements, organizing events, and working to undo the damage she had done. A summer block party was held as a way to celebrate new beginnings. Food trucks lined the street, music played, children splashed in sprinklers, and for the first time, we all felt like we belonged. Emily sat on a folding chair with her hands resting on her growing belly, smiling as people came up to thank her for her courage, telling her that her voice in court had inspired them to finally stand up to. She was becoming a quiet symbol of resilience in the neighborhood. Not because she sought attention, but because she had lived through Karen's cruelty and refused to be broken by it. But while Karen was gone, her shadow sometimes loomed in whispers. Occasionally, we'd hear rumors about her appeals being denied. Her letters from prison filled with delusional rants about how she was wronged, how she'd return and reclaim what was hers, but nobody took them seriously anymore. Her threats had lost their sting. She had been stripped of her power, reduced to a cautionary tale told to new residents when they asked why the community bylaws were rewritten to emphasize compassion and accountability. It was strange to think how much of our lives had been shaped by her malice, yet here we were. Thriving in the aftermath of her downfall, she had thought herself irreplaceable. But the truth was, without her, everything became better. The day Emily went into labor was one filled with both fear and hope. When her contractions began in the early hours, I rushed her to the hospital, my mind flashing back to that terrible night when we'd been denied help by Karen's interference. But this time, nothing stood in our way. The ambulance arrived swiftly. The EMTs guided Emily gently, their voices calm and reassuring. The roads were clear, and the sheriff himself, hearing the call over dispatch, followed behind the ambulance just to make sure nothing hindered us. When Emily was wheeled into the delivery room, I held her hand through every cry, every push, every tear, until finally the cries of our newborn filled the room. A sound so pure and beautiful it made the world itself seem to pause. The doctor announced we had a healthy baby girl, and Emily clutched her close, whispering, "You're safe now, you're safe." As tears streamed down her face, I kissed them both, overwhelmed with gratitude that our daughter had entered a world where Karen no longer had the power to endanger her. When we brought our daughter home, the neighborhood gathered outside with balloons and banners, cheering as if she were a symbol of victory over the darkness we had endured. Ruth held the baby and whispered blessings. The sheriff tipped his hat and said, "This little one will grow up knowing what true community means." The sight of neighbors who had once been divided, now standing together, united in celebration, was proof of how much things had changed. Our daughter became a beacon of hope, reminding everyone of what was nearly lost and what had been preserved because we had stood up, because justice had prevailed, because Karen had been stopped before it was too late. Yet I knew, as I looked at the tiny face of my child, that the fight wasn't just about Karen, it was about what she represented: unchecked power, cruelty disguised as authority, the willingness to put personal pride over human life. And that was a lesson that would live on in all of us. It was a reminder to never again allow fear to silence us, to always protect those who cannot protect themselves, to make sure that what happened to Emily and me never happened to another family. As the sheriff said one evening, sitting on our porch, evil doesn't always come with a mask or a weapon. Sometimes it hides behind a smile and a title. That's why we've got to stay vigilant. His words stuck with me, shaping how I looked at leadership, authority, and the importance of standing up when something isn't right. Years later, when I'd walk my daughter to school, passing the same street where Karen once blocked that ambulance, I'd feel a strange mix of sorrow and pride. Sorrow for the pain we endured, but pride for the strength we found in the aftermath. Neighbors still greeted us warmly, often stopping to admire how much she had grown. And every holiday, the block would be lit with decorations brighter than ever before, a subtle defiance against the shadows Karen had tried to cast. Our community wasn't perfect. No community is. But it was resilient, alive, and filled with people who now understood the value of compassion over control. And every time I looked at Emily laughing with our daughter in the yard, I knew we had not just survived Karen's cruelty, we had defeated it. And so, the story of Karen wasn't just about the downfall of one woman drunk on power. It was about the triumph of justice, the resilience of a community, and the unbreakable bond between a family that refused to be broken. It was about learning that no one, no matter how loud, how controlling, or how manipulative, could stand in the way of love and life. Karen had thought she could write the rules for everyone. But in the end, the sheriff, the courts, the people wrote the final chapter of her story, one that ended with her downfall and our renewal. As I hold my daughter now, I whisper to her, "This is your world, and no one will ever take away. You're right to live it freely, and I know in my heart that the sheriff truly did make Karen regret it." If you've been gripped by this story of injustice, resilience, and ultimate redemption, don't let it end. Here more powerful stories are waiting to be told. Stories that reveal the strength of ordinary people standing up to cruelty and abuse, of power. Make sure you don't miss the next one. Hit that subscribe button to join us at Sham Stories, where every tale reminds us of the power of justice, community, and the unbreakable human spirit.